There are stories that do not merely belong to the past, they carve themselves into the foundations of how civilizations think, believe, and dream. When we speak of Al-Ghazali, we are not just revisiting the life of a scholar. We are returning to a moment in history when the human mind stood between certainty and doubt, faith and philosophy, despair and awakening. His journey is more than a biography. It is a cinematic arc of collapse and rebirth, a spiritual odyssey that still echoes across centuries. And today, as we explore the complete philosophical vision of Al-Ghazali, we are not only uncovering his ideas, we are rediscovering the inner logic of our own search for meaning. Before we begin, if you find depth, value, and inspiration in this series, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the motivation that helps me continue creating powerful, meaningful content for the community. When imagining a historical documentary or narrative film about Al-Ghazali, the first frame cannot be a dusty library nor a distant desert horizon. It must begin with a man who once had everything: prestige, mastery of religious sciences, influence in political circles, and the admiration of scholars. Yet inside him, a silent storm was growing. His mind, trained to dissect arguments and chase logical purity, collided with a deeper hunger, something no rational structure could satisfy. This tension, this invisible fracture within a brilliant intellect, is the core of the story. It is also the source of the philosophical system he later built. To make a compelling cinematic narrative, the focus must not be on listing doctrines or offering abstract summaries. Instead, we must enter the emotional and intellectual landscape of his life. Al-Ghazali's philosophy is born from crisis. His work is not the cold arrangement of theories, but the trembling reconstruction of a soul seeking certainty. What makes his philosophy so complete is not its complexity but its honesty. He questioned everything, including himself, and by doing so he gave the world a roadmap to navigate doubt, meaning, and human purpose. A historical film built on this foundation would follow the evolution of a mind confronting the limits of human knowledge. It would explore how he bridged the gap between rational philosophy and spiritual experience, a gap that still challenges modern audiences. His life becomes a narrative mirror in which viewers recognize their own anxieties about faith, identity, truth, and the fear of being wrong in a world demanding certainty. In this opening part, we prepare the emotional terrain. The story begins not with theological disputes, but with Al-Ghazali's inner fracture, the moment when the world he had built with logic and reputation began to collapse. This moment is the key to understanding why his eventual synthesis, between reason, spirituality, and lived experience, is not just a philosophical model but a human triumph. Every powerful philosophical system begins with a fracture, a moment when the familiar world suddenly loses shape. For Al-Ghazali, this fracture was not caused by external enemies, political pressure, or intellectual rivals. It emerged quietly from within, like a subtle crack spreading beneath the surface of a flawless stone. At the height of his career in Baghdad, he was the celebrated head of the Nizamiya College, a position envied by scholars and admired by rulers. To the world, he was a master. But internally, a storm was gathering, invisible and relentless. The first signs of collapse were small but unmistakable. His lectures, once delivered with sharp confidence, became difficult to perform. His voice trembled. Words failed him. One morning, he found he could not speak at all. The man who commanded audiences with precision suddenly became a prisoner of silence. This moment is not merely a biographical detail. It is the cinematic turning point where the hero confronts something far more dangerous than intellectual opponents. He confronts his own uncertainty. Al-Ghazali began to realize that his mastery of knowledge had become hollow. He could win debates, yet he felt disconnected from truth. He could defend doctrines, yet he sensed that certainty cannot be inherited from teachers or books, it must be lived. The growing gap between what he taught and what he believed created an unbearable weight. His crisis was not just psychological. It was philosophical, spiritual, existential. His mind rebelled against its own foundations. This inner collapse becomes a crucial narrative thread for any historical film. It transforms him from a distant intellectual figure into a deeply human character, someone struggling with the same fears audiences today recognize in themselves: the fear of being wrong, the fear of living without direction, the fear of losing meaning despite success. The brilliance of Al-Ghazali's journey lies in the vulnerability of this collapse. Instead of hiding it, he documented it with honesty, allowing future generations to follow his struggle step by step. When he walked away from Baghdad, leaving behind his wealth, his position, and even his family, it was not an act of escape but a search for reconstruction. He chose silence over applause, solitude over prestige. In cinematic terms, this is the moment the protagonist abandons everything familiar and steps into the unknown. The audience senses that this departure is not weakness, it is transformation beginning. Al-Ghazali's collapse is also the foundation of his complete philosophy. He dismantled his intellectual world so he could rebuild it from a place of authenticity. His doubt was not destructive. It was purifying. It forced him to question the reliability of perception, the limitations of logic, and the boundaries of theological discourse. This period of crisis becomes the emotional core of any narrative about him. It reveals the cost of wisdom, the vulnerability behind genius, and the silent courage required to abandon false certainty. Through this collapse, he prepared the ground for a philosophy that unites the analytical clarity of reason with the depth of spiritual experience. His crisis becomes a universal lesson: truth demands the courage to break before we can rise. When Al-Ghazali stepped away from Baghdad, leaving behind prestige and applause, he entered a world that no longer depended on external validation. This journey is not defined by geographical distance, but by spiritual depth. A historical film depicting this period would shift in atmosphere. The bustling intellectual life of the capital fades into the quiet, contemplative landscapes of Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and isolated retreats. Silence becomes a character in the story, shaping his thoughts more profoundly than any debate ever had. During this period, Al-Ghazali immersed himself in a kind of intellectual purification. He wanted to identify which forms of human knowledge could truly guide the soul, and which merely decorated the mind. The tension of his earlier crisis did not disappear. It evolved into a disciplined search for clarity. He scrutinized every path of knowledge available in his time: theology, philosophy, logic, law, and especially the mystical tradition of Sufism. His aim was not to reject or glorify any discipline but to understand their limits and their proper place in the human quest for meaning. What gives this phase of his life such cinematic power is the solitude in which he confronts the largest questions a human being can ask. What can the senses actually guarantee? Can pure reason lead to certainty, or does it circle endlessly around itself? Is faith a matter of inherited doctrines, or does true understanding require personal experience? These questions were not abstract puzzles for him. They were urgent, existential demands. The man who once spoke with authoritative certainty now demanded proof not from others but from his own heart. This journey becomes a symbolic descent into the inner world. It mirrors the archetypal narrative of the hero who must leave the kingdom, wander the wilderness, confront the shadows within, and return transformed. For Al-Ghazali, this shadow was the realization that human knowledge, no matter how sophisticated, has boundaries. The senses can deceive, reasoning can construct illusions, and even religious institutions can confuse repetition with understanding. This insight did not lead him toward nihilism, but toward humility. He discovered that certainty arises not from controlling knowledge, but from aligning the heart with what cannot be reduced to formulas. In this phase, Sufism becomes central to his transformation. He saw in it a path that did not reject reason but placed it in proper context. Mystical experience, disciplined introspection, and ethical sincerity offered what logic alone could not: direct encounter with meaning. A film portraying this shift would not employ spectacular supernatural imagery. Instead, it would show quiet, deliberate moments, a lamp flickering in a dim room as he writes, footsteps echoing in an empty mosque at dawn, the slow unfolding of insight during prolonged solitude. These scenes would communicate a truth Al-Ghazali emphasized repeatedly: that genuine knowledge is as much a work of the soul as of the mind. What makes this journey compelling for modern audiences is its universal resonance. Everyone faces moments when the external world fails to provide answers, when success feels empty, when intellectual confidence collapses into silent questioning. Al-Ghazali's retreat becomes a metaphor for the inner pilgrimage every human must undertake. He teaches that the journey inward is not an escape from reality, but a return to the deeper foundations of being. Every collapse, if met with courage and honesty, becomes the foundation for a new structure. For Al-Ghazali, the years of solitude and spiritual discipline did not merely heal his crisis. They reshaped his entire understanding of what it means to know. When he eventually returned to public life, he did not come back as the same scholar who once lectured with intellectual pride. He returned as someone who had rebuilt knowledge from the inside out, grounding it in sincerity, inner transformation, and lived experience. A historical film depicting this chapter would shift from the contemplative stillness of his journey inward to a deliberate reconstruction of the world he had once questioned. His philosophy did not emerge as a rejection of reason or a blind acceptance of tradition. Instead, it formed a unified system that placed every type of knowledge in its rightful order. He recognized the power of logic, the necessity of law, the value of theology, and the depth of mysticism. But he insisted that none of these forms stands on its own. Meaning arises when the heart, mind, and soul work together in harmony. This reconstruction begins with the realization that reason is a powerful tool but a limited one. Al-Ghazali saw that logical structures can analyze and clarify, yet they cannot produce certainty about the deepest truths. They can prove the existence of causes but not the meaning behind them. In cinematic terms, this could be portrayed as a shift in lighting, the sharp, precise lines of rational thought contrasted with the softer, more luminous glow of spiritual insight. Reason becomes a lamp, not the sun. It illuminates what lies directly before us, but it cannot replace the source of light itself. His critique of philosophy was not an attack on its intentions but a correction of its scope. Philosophers of his time believed that human intellect alone could answer every question about the universe. Al-Ghazali challenged this confidence, arguing that intellect without spiritual grounding becomes trapped within its own walls. True knowledge requires humility, because the human mind perceives only fragments. The full view belongs to something beyond reason, something only spiritual experience can glimpse. The most compelling aspect of this reconstruction is how practical it becomes. Al-Ghazali insists that knowledge must transform character, reshape intentions, and guide behavior. A person can master theology yet remain arrogant, master logic yet remain empty, memorize scripture yet remain blind to meaning. Real knowledge, he argues, is what changes the heart. This theme gives his philosophy cinematic depth, because it transforms abstract ideas into a human drama of ethical struggle, self-discipline, and spiritual awakening. He envisioned a society where scholars are not merely intellectual authorities but moral exemplars. Knowledge becomes a trust, not a trophy. It must serve the inner purification of the individual and the well-being of the community. This understanding gives his system a timeless relevance. In an age overwhelmed by information but starved of wisdom, his philosophy reminds us that the purpose of knowing is not to dominate others but to become more humane. Al-Ghazali's reconstruction of knowledge stands as one of the most influential intellectual achievements in history. It bridges disciplines, cultures, and even eras, offering a model where faith and reason enrich rather than threaten each other. His system becomes a map for audiences seeking clarity in a chaotic world, showing that truth is not found in extremes but in balance. The true measure of a philosophical system is not its complexity but its ability to guide human behavior. For Al-Ghazali, philosophy was not an intellectual game but a moral responsibility. After reconstructing the foundations of knowledge, he turned his attention to the ethical dimension of human life. This shift is essential to understanding why his ideas influenced not only scholars but entire cultures for centuries. His philosophy insists that inner transformation is the root of all meaningful action, and that the world changes only when the human heart does. A historical film portraying this chapter would draw the audience into a quieter, more intimate space. Instead of large debates or dramatic departures, the scenes would focus on daily life, a teacher speaking gently to children, a scholar giving away his possessions, an elder sitting alone in reflection. Through these simple actions, Al-Ghazali demonstrated that virtue is not found in grand gestures but in the discipline of small, sincere choices. His ethical philosophy does not elevate saints above ordinary people. It shows that every individual is capable of cultivating wisdom through intention, humility, and self-awareness. Central to his ethical vision is the idea that the human heart is a mirror. It reflects truth when polished through sincerity, discipline, and self-examination. When clouded by arrogance, envy, greed, or vanity, it distorts reality and leads individuals toward harm. This metaphor gives filmmakers a powerful visual language, scenes of a mirror gradually clearing, light becoming brighter, shadows dissolving. In Al-Ghazali's writings, ethical purification is not merely symbolic, it is a practical method of aligning human character with divine guidance. He argued that knowledge without moral development becomes dangerous. A brilliant mind can be corrupted by pride just as easily as an ignorant one can be misled by confusion. Therefore, learning must be tied to self-discipline. A person must examine their motives, confront their flaws, and cultivate virtues such as patience, gratitude, generosity, and honesty. These virtues are not abstract ideals but lived practices that shape how individuals interact with the world. Al-Ghazali transforms ethics into a journey rather than a list of commandments, allowing audiences to connect emotionally with the struggle to become better. In this chapter of his life, his writings show a newfound tenderness. He speaks not from the podium of a celebrated scholar but from the heart of someone who understands human weakness. He acknowledges fear, doubt, anger, and desire, not as sins to be condemned, but as forces to be understood and transformed. This compassionate view gives his ethical system a depth that resonates across cultures and eras. It portrays morality as a path open to everyone, not only scholars or mystics. What makes his ethical philosophy so profoundly cinematic is the tension between inner struggle and outward simplicity. Al-Ghazali teaches that the most important battles are invisible. A person may appear calm while wrestling with envy, or appear righteous while hiding arrogance. The real transformation happens where no audience can see it. This idea gives filmmakers the opportunity to portray silent, introspective sequences where the internal becomes more intense than the external, showing that morality is a private dialogue between the self and its highest potential. His ethical vision ultimately provides the emotional anchor for his entire philosophical system. It unites knowledge, spirituality, and human behavior into a coherent whole. It speaks to audiences today because it offers a timeless truth: wisdom is not what we know but what we become. Every great historical narrative reaches a point where the life of one individual transcends its time and becomes a mirror for humanity. In the case of Al-Ghazali, his legacy is not confined to dusty manuscripts or academic footnotes. His ideas reshape civilizations, influence thinkers across continents, and continue to speak with clarity to an age overwhelmed by uncertainty. A film exploring his complete philosophy would not end with his death. It would end with the enduring ripple of his thought, a reflection on why his voice remains relevant in a world so different from his own. His influence spread because he addressed the universal human struggle, the need to reconcile intellect with experience, structure with spirit, and certainty with humility. He offered a framework in which knowledge becomes meaningful only when it shapes character, where faith becomes powerful only when supported by reason, and where reason becomes noble only when grounded in spiritual awareness. This balance is the essence of his legacy. It offers modern viewers a powerful antidote to the fragmentation of contemporary life, inviting them to see truth not as a battlefield of competing theories but as a harmony of complementary insights. A cinematic portrayal of his final years would emphasize stillness rather than spectacle. Al-Ghazali withdrew again from the public world, not in crisis this time, but in completion. He taught in small circles, guided students with patience, and wrote with the calm confidence of someone who had found inner coherence. A filmmaker could show the contrast: the young scholar battling with doubt in crowded lecture halls versus the older sage quietly teaching by lamplight, radiating a peace that comes from understanding the limits of human knowledge and the vastness of divine wisdom. His legacy is also a testament to intellectual courage. He challenged philosophers who overestimated the power of the mind. He challenged theologians who mistook repetition for understanding. He challenged mystics who abandoned structure for vague emotions. And he challenged himself most of all. This self-confrontation gives his story an emotional power that resonates with audiences today. His philosophy becomes a call to examine one's own beliefs, motives, and aspirations, not through fear, but through sincerity. In a modern context, his ideas illuminate the crises of our era. He warns against the arrogance of assuming that logic alone can solve existential questions. He warns against spiritual emptiness disguised as intellectual brilliance. He warns against societies that pursue knowledge without cultivating compassion. These themes make his thought ideal for a historical documentary or narrative film, because they bridge past and present with striking relevance. His voice speaks to viewers navigating a world where information is abundant but wisdom is rare, where certainty is proclaimed loudly but lived quietly, where identity is fragmented by noise and distraction. The final message of a film about Al-Ghazali would not be a celebration of a historical figure, but an invitation to the audience. His life demonstrates that truth is not found in extremes. Not in blind faith, nor in cold rationalism. Not in withdrawal from the world, nor in total immersion in it. Truth emerges when the human mind and heart are brought into balance, grounded in humility, and elevated by sincere pursuit. This is the meaning of his complete philosophy, a unified vision of the human journey, where the search for knowledge becomes a path toward becoming fully alive. It is this message, timeless, universal, and profoundly human, that would linger with viewers long after the screen goes dark.